Hello and welcome to another lesson on the GCSE exam mastery course. Today we are looking at the WJEC exam, taking that exam. Make sure that you are paying attention to this so that you can pick up all the little tips that help you be as possibly to exams whenever it is that you are taking them. So the objectives of today is to try and understand what exactly the specification looks like, how it's laid out in terms of the exam, which topics go to which exam papers, these sorts of ideas, the different types of exam questions as well. We're going to try and understand what they look like, how to best answer them. We're going to try and apply the techniques that have been given by the exam boards that sort of recommend this is how you should go about answering a question, this is how you should attempt to be the most successful you possibly. And then we're actually going to try and practice some of those GCSE questions and have a go at ourselves under timed conditions and see how we get on using the information we take from this lesson. So there are three possible units that you will do. Unit 1 is specifically looking at the religious beliefs, teachings and practices of two religions. So that's usually Christianity, which is the compulsory one, and then any other of the major World 6 religions. Now, depending on the course that you're doing, if you're a short course, you will just do part 1 and part 2. Part 2 being the religious response to philosophy. So you look at ideas around life and good and evil. So if you're doing the short course, you will just do Unit 1. You'll see there under Part 1, there is a bit there for Catholic theology and Judaism. We'll come on to that in just a second and where that fits in. But in the long course, there's the standard GCSE. You also then do Unit 2. Which has, again, two parts to it. One of them talks about the religious beliefs, teachings and practices of two religions. So it's a little bit further detail on Christianity and which other religion you are studying. 2 is religious responses to ethics. So this looks more specifically into human relationships and the sort of roles that we have within those relationships and some of the religious views around key topics over in the themes part of this classroom, as well as then looking at human rights and, how do our human rights sort of impact the way that we live? What are religious views on the rights that we should and shouldn't have? Now, if you're doing long course, just do Unit 1 and 2. Now, there is a third option here where if you had chosen to do specifically Catholic, now this allows you then Unit 3. So if you're doing the Catholic course, again, it's in two different parts. You've got Catholic Christianity beliefs, teachings and practices, as well as then Catholic responses to ethics, human rights and relationships. So you do Part 1, but you do Catholic theology and Judaism, along with Part 2, religious responses to philosophy, and then you do Unit 3 instead of Unit 2. So again, just focusing in on that Catholic perspective of Christianity. That's the way that it's laid out in terms of the papers then. So the paper layout then, they are about 2 hours long each, and they consist of 4 different sections. So you'll have the beliefs and teachings and the practices of one religion being one part, the beliefs, teachings and practices of another religion being the second part, and then you'd have the two sort of themes. So in the paper 1, that would be your philosophical themes. So life and death, for example, would come up as those extra 2 sections. Now, in terms of the question types that you have 2, 5, 8 and 15 mark questions available, giving you plenty opportunity to demonstrate your knowledge and demonstrate your understanding of those religions through some sort of longer evaluative type questions. So this is the way that it is then laid out in terms of its total marks. I thought I would throw this up here because it's sometimes useful to know where the majority of the marks come from. Now, a lot of the marks will come from that Part A, so specifically that Section 1, which is usually Christianity. Part of the reason for that is because you'll see there is a spelling and punctuation and grammar marks available. For the 15 mark question, there is also a total of 6 spelling, punctuation and grammar marks available to you. So if you can be successful in that area in particular, you know that you're going to be well on your way to sort of being successful. It also goes to show just how important it is to try and answer questions in every section, because if you use the entirety of one of those sections, you've lost 25% of your paper. So it's really important you are answering as many questions as you can throughout the entirety of that paper. Now, some of the command words that are used throughout this exam would be words such as what do or what does X, Y, and Z mean? Would usually be a definition. What do Christians believe about the resurrection? It's usually a definition question. It's something that they're looking for you to define something. It's not something that has to be too complex. It then will ask you to describe, where it wants you to talk about a few different aspects of a particular practice or a particular belief, where it gives you an opportunity to show that you have a bit of a deeper understanding other than just a basic definition. At times you'll be asked to explain, so especially in those 8-mark questions, you'll be asked to explain. You have to not only be able to say what something is and why and sort of how it's done, but also why it's done, looking into the deeper understanding of how you apply the religious beliefs into the practices and vice versa, how you can apply the practices in your life to sort of solidify your understanding and the beliefs that you hold. And then finally you get to those 15-mark questions which use the word discuss. Now this is because it asks you to talk about a particular statement, which you're going to have to break down into 2 different arguments, one for the statement and one going against the statement. But we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go throughout this session. So what I thought we would do to start off with is have a look at what exactly a 2-mark question is. And here is an example of a 2-mark question pulled from one of the WJEC past papers. And the question was simply, what do Christians mean by the Holy Spirit? Now, for all questions, what I've done here is I have taken segments from the mark scheme so you can see how exactly it is broken down in terms of the marking. If you can understand how it's know how to perfectly write your answer to help you be as successful as you possibly can be. So it says here, for all A questions, credit 1 mark for a very simple definition, 2 marks for a developed definition, and or an example. So basically you need to give a very simple definition that's going to get you 1 mark. To get that 2nd mark, you need to develop that with some sort of further sort of development, or you could possibly use an example. Here is an example answer then. And what I have done is I have put the bits in blue as the sort of simple and developed definition, and then the bit in red there is an example. Now this could potentially be overkill. You could potentially get the marks after the first section of red, and therefore wouldn't need that 2nd section of blue. What I thought I'd do once showing you an example answer in this case would be go through some of my advice. How would I tackle this question? What would I sort of want to focus on in terms of making sure that I am being successful? Now, this may seem like rather extreme timing, but to write 2 sentences that don't have to be overly developed, there needs to be a little bit of development there, but not huge amounts. To say 1 minute of writing should be good enough to write 2 sentences. If you're taking about 20 to 30 seconds per sentence, you should be in a position where you can write 2-3 sentences fairly comfortably. Now, this is something that if you are someone who does struggle as being a little bit of a slower writer, this is something that just takes time. And one thing I would definitely recommend then is using the wording of the definition and keeping sentences short and simple. So when using the wording of starter almost, you do need to make sure that they are full sentences, so you can't cut corners there. You need to make sure that you have all your sentences sort of making full, complete sense, which is why using the wording of the question can sometimes be so useful, especially then because it frames your sentences so that you don't start repeating information. When you say, what Christians mean by the Holy Spirit is, you then sort of give that initial definition. You're then going to give a further development, so you could say, this means that, or this means Christians believe in, and therefore you're less likely to start repeating yourself. So you can see how we've got the first point being one of the 3 persons of the Holy Trinity. That's one belief about the Holy Spirit. The second belief could be that the Holy Spirit is present and that as the power of God is at work in the world. So you can say that those are 2 very different definitions, but are also completely valid. You could get 2 marks just for the 2 bits in blue. You could get 2 marks for the bit in blue and the bit in red as well. For the 5-mark questions, this is where you're going to start needing to do a little bit more with your writing. So what I thought we'd do is actually look at the different bands of marking that are available to you and break them down a little bit for you. So to get 1 mark in the 5-mark question, you need to have 1 sentence giving very little description. When you're looking at that mark scheme there, you might have a little bit of information about the religious idea, but it's not going to be anything that shows you have a particular developed view. You could describe 1 idea, but give 2 in total. So you could have 1 very limited view and 1 that has a little bit more depth, but you don't necessarily go into too much detail. You might use 1 particular belief with particular religious teaching, for example. A few sort of key terms as well as another way to sort of boost your success. But that again is only going to get you sort of 2 to 3 marks. What they're looking for, really, describing two sort of big ideas. If you were to get 4 marks, this would be usually without a reference to some sort of source of authority. But if you want to get the full 5 marks, you want to describe 2 ideas with authority. So that could be a religious text, that could be a religious leader, that could be somebody of importance within the religion, that could be songs or reference to hymns or prayers. Any sort of ideas along those lines is what's going to get you those 5 marks. If you can show that you have good awareness of what a particular concept is, and you can describe it with detail, and you can give a quotation or a story that links to that idea, then you're definitely going to find yourself being successful. So my key tips then for this question. Now, like I said in the last bit, use the wording of the question to help you. What tends to happen as somebody who has marked for other examples in the past, I see people starting to answer the question and immediately go wrong because their sentence starter has led them down a rabbit hole that isn't actually answering the question. By using the wording of the question, you are instantly going to start answering the question because you're not going to be able to stray away from that initial sentence starter. It forms in your mind what exactly you need to be saying. I would recommend for this question somewhere in the region of 4 to 5 minutes. Again, looking at about a mark a minute, you're going to want to make sure that you are saving as much time in these questions. So again, if you can use really snappy sentence starters, or you can use repetitive sentence starters that you can remember really easily, so you're not having that moment to have to think about how do you start saying what you need to say. The more time you save on these questions, the better that's going to be for you for the longer questions, but we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Make sure though that you haven't your source of authority. When you do give some sort of quotation or reference to something that someone has said or something that is written in a particular book, you want to make sure that you reference it just to show that you can use it accurately. When you get into sort of later stages of life, when you're doing either sort of post-16 work, doing A-levels, or even going to university, the ability to reference is really important. So something that the exam boards look for at this stage is just for you to be able to recognize where it is that these quotations come from. It also makes sure that they can then also find those quotations just to be able to fact check what it is that you're doing. If you just quotation without any reference to where it's from, that could be something that is said by the Buddha, said by Jesus, said in the Quran, said by Guru Gobind Singh. You know, there's all sorts of different possibilities of where that quotation could come from. So finding it is going to be a little bit harder. So giving you the marks is going to be harder. By referencing it, it's actually going to make the examiner's life easier to give you marks. So just make sure that you have got that reference in there. Now, an 8-mark question is again very similar, that I thought I again would go through the different band descriptors with you, just because it's something that would be useful to understand exactly how much writing do you need to do in order to get how many marks. Now, the suggested structure, if you want to get full marks, is having 3 points, explain all of those points, and give at least 2 quotations in there. So point, evidence, explain. This is because you need to be able to show a highly detailed explanation showing awareness and insight into the particular religious idea, belief, practice, or teaching that you are focusing on within that question. If you do not use enough points, you're going to find it really difficult to show a really in-depth awareness or insight into whatever the question is about. You also need to be able to use a range of religious specialist language or sources of authority references. And if you only have 1 or 2, you're able to use a range of those. So you want to have enough sentences there where you can actually start using some of that sort of tier 3 vocabulary that you'll hear people talk about, those ideas of those specialist terms that are used specifically for that religion. If you don't use them, you're going to struggle to get into that top band. In fact, if you don't use them at all, you're going to really struggle to get past maybe band 1 or 2, depending on how much explanation you give. You know, if you use it with some accuracy, maybe you use 1 or 2 terms, that's going to go well for you. But if you don't use any at all, you can read down there in band 1, use a religious specialist language, terms and all sorts of wisdom and authority in a limited way and with little accuracy. If you use it in a limited way, that's going to really cap you in terms of marks. So just making sure that you do use those keywords that you use, I'm sure, all the time at school, and making sure that you use those quotations, references in your answers. It's absolutely crucial. Now, some key tips here for this question. You do get a little bit longer with this question. Now, depending on how quickly you write, somewhere in the region of 5 to 10 minutes, I would recommend for this particular question. The reason I've given a bit of a bracket in terms of how much time you have is because obviously different people are going to have different writing speeds. And I just wanted you to be aware that you can get this done in 5 minutes if you are very quick with it. If you're sort of a faster writer, but you know that you need to spend more time on those 15-mark questions, this is possible to do. However, if you know that you do struggle a little bit more, to sort of have a little bit of reassurance that you do have 10 minutes to answer this question. Now, again, use the wording of the question to help you out here. I think it's really, really important. Now, when to find numerous parts of evidence to use within your answer, sometimes it can be really useful to think of your evidence first. This is because it can be really easy to think of points about a particular idea. However, if you think of a point that you then can't reference or you can't evidence in any way, shape or form, it's kind of a useless point. You can only have one point that doesn't have evidence. You need to have at least 2 bits of evidence first. You can then pull the points out from that evidence. So say, for example, the question was about this is loving nature, and you said how he taught parables to people to demonstrate how people should be kind to each other. For example, in the Good Samaritan, you're demonstrating that we know from the Good Samaritan, that is a parable that Jesus taught that taught people to love. So you can start with the bit of evidence first, the Good Samaritan, pull out the rest of it. That's a really easy way to make sure you have evidence and references for every single point that you use in your answer, just to guarantee you those high marks. Now, here are some of the appropriate answers that were given on the exam board, as well as some of the different bits of evidence that you could have used within your answer. Now, the question was explain Christian teachings about forgiveness. What I thought I would let you guys do is to use this mark scheme and a timer to answer this question. Now, do feel free to rewind this, go back to the previous slide, or feel free to pause it on this slide here to really have a look at some of those points, and you can literally pull them out of the mark scheme here, put them into sentences, and just see how you get on with doing it in the time. If you find that you're going over 10 minutes, can you shorten some of your sentences? This isn't necessarily me asking you to write to show your knowledge, but purely on the basis of trying to get used to writing it within the time frame. If you're sitting perfectly between those 5 to 10 minute sort of marks, then you are doing very, very well, and that's a question that you should have a lot of confidence in. Do feel free then to also use the mark scheme to have a go at marking the question yourself. If you're not too sure on how to do that, feel free to send your answer to me, and I'm happy to mark it for you and give you some feedback on it as well. Now we come on to the dreaded 15-mark question that nobody wants to do, but is where about half of your marks will come from. So it's a really important question to get right. Now, the layout of a 15-mark question is that you will have a statement where you will have to discuss that statement in some sort of way, usually having one part of your argument agreeing with the statement and one part of your answer disagreeing with the statement. Now, the way that I would start my answer is actually by starting with some sort of way of talking about the statement and just saying what the two sides are going to be within the answer. I then go into talking about the arguments in agreement with the statement, and I would do that first. The problem is, if you do not do this first and you only write the second paragraph, the arguments in disagreement with the statement, if you never actually discuss why the statement could be the best answer or could be believed by particular religious followers, if you do not discuss this at all within your answer, you're not going to get any marks at all. So it's really important that you discuss and say why the belief within the statement is correct, is the correct belief or is the correct practice, whatever the 15-mark question is at the time. It's really important that you do that, because without that, you are not going to get the marks. So if you start with that, you're just guaranteeing that you're going to get at least half marks for the question. If you only answer half question, then you know that you can half mark. If you only did half the question but you wrote the disagree side, 0 marks. You're then, once you have done all of your arguments in agreement with the statement, you're then going to display your arguments against the statement. Usually you will do this by proposing some sort of alternative idea. If it's a belief question, then an alternative belief, which is more important. If it's a practice, it's a better practice that will help you to please God, whatever the question might be. You're then going to finish kind of conclusion. Now, we'll talk about this in a little bit more depth in a second, but I will just like to say that it is really important that you do come to some sort of conclusion. Don't just sit on the fence. You can say that both sides have really strong points, but try to lean more one way than the other. It's really important to remember that the exam board do not care about your opinion, and therefore whatever conclusion that you give, as long as it is justified, is valid. Therefore, it does not have to be your opinion. If you're not sure and you need to go one way or the other, just pick one side. It does not matter which way that you go. Now, the paragraph structure in themselves would look something like this. I will 2 to 3 points per paragraph. I'll explain why. You can have a range of that in just a minute. And again, you want to try and have a bit of evidence for every point. So different to the 8 mark, you want to have a bit of evidence for every point that you have. You're going to want to explain every point that you have as well. So again, you're going to want 2 to 3 points per paragraph. And then you're going to want to have at least one sort of detailed evaluation end of your paragraph that sort of talks about either the complete strengths of this argument or the weaknesses of this argument. Not just saying what those are, but explaining why they're strengths and why they're weaknesses, going into that deep level of development. Now, in terms of timing, my recommendation is somewhere in the region of 15 to 20 minutes. This is a question that is going to take you a little bit longer because you have to think about it more. You have to write significantly more. You have to be able to go into significantly more depth. So that's why I proposed a slightly longer time limit. What I'm now going to do is go through the different segments of the mark scheme, going through the different bands, and what you need to do in order to get those different amounts of marks. Before I do so, though, it's really important that you know that you can only refer to atheist views in section 3 and 4 in both papers. You can't use atheist views to counter religious views in part 1A and B. You could use atheist views in section 3 and section 4. You cannot use atheist views anywhere else. But also make sure that when you are referring to different groups, use some/others instead of being specific, unless the exam you're doing, say for example within Catholic Christianity, for example, requires you to do so. The problem is if you were to say something is a Sunni Muslim belief, but it turned out to be a Shia Muslim belief, everything is therefore factually incorrect. If, say, some Muslims believe, it is true to say that some Muslims believe that particular belief. Not all of them may believe that, but some of them certainly will. But even if all of them do, it is still true to say that some of them do. So using some/others is much better for you rather than using Protestants versus Catholics, Sunnis versus Shias, those kinds of ideas. Now, if you were looking just to try and get the lower end of the mark scheme, say, for example, you're running out of time and you've only got about 5-10 minutes left of your answer and you know you can't get a complete 15-mark question done. What I thought I would do is show you what you need to do to achieve the lower end so you can see the very simple ways you can get into the higher. Now, for the first 2 bands, obviously if you write nothing at all, you're going to score 0. So make sure that you do write something for the question. You're guaranteeing yourself some marks as long as it is linked to what the question is actually talking about. Now, if you do not have any evaluation in there at all, and you make very limited sort of judgments, and you don't have any knowledge of the religion, the teachings, or any sort of behind your answers, you're going to really struggle to get past 1 marks. If you have some understanding of religious teaching, but really limited reasoning for why that is a strong belief, let's say you just give some basic points with no real development, you could get up to 3 marks. However, the moment you start explaining those points, your reference to any sort of source of authority is limited or non-existent, still get up to 7 marks, especially if it is only one side of the argument. If you go sort of deeper, what you can see here is you can still score 7 marks if you have 2 sides explained with not a huge amount of development and let's say one quotation. If you wanted 7, let's have 1 point one-sided with explanation, 1 point one-sided with a good explanation, and a bit of evidence. You can score up to 7 marks doing that. You need to know reference to specialist religious language. That is also going to get you that sort of deeper AO2 mark, which is going to show that sort of reference to your knowledge of that particular religion that you're answering a question on. So it can be really straightforward to get 7 marks. You can write very easily 2 points and evidence and 2 explanation sentences with, let's say, 1 sentence of a conclusion. You can get that done in easily 5 minutes. So if you know you've got 5 minutes left on the clock and you've seen a 15-mark question, don't just sit there and go, oh, well, I'm out of time, I may as well not bother. You can still score an X marks, which is, it can be huge. That can be the difference of sometimes even 2 grade boundaries. So just by doing those basic things, you can still score very, very well. Make sure, though, when you are answering, at least one of those points is referring back to the statement. I cannot stress this enough. If you do not statement, you will only score 0 because no relevant point has been stated. Nothing has been stated that's actually linking to the question. You need that initial discussion of the question first in order to be able to discuss about something else. Now, if you were looking to try and achieve the higher end of the table and you wanted to try and get those higher marks, here is the grade. I'm going to give you an opportunity to pause the video here and just read through the mark scheme so you're really, really clear with what it is that you need to do in order to achieve those 15 marks. I'm going to go through some of my key takeaways in 3, 2, and 1. So some of my key takeaways then is that if you have a detailed evaluation, something is a strong or weak argument, but actually giving reasons as to why, this is going to score you very, very well. You're going to get into that band 4 of marking, provided that you have done everything else that you need to. If you have given a keyword or a source of authority for every point, you're going to again get into that band 4, but you have that really detailed, deep knowledge, making sure that you are consistently and constantly looking back at the statement after each point, linking it back. Even when you are talking in the paragraph against, you want to be saying why this is a stronger argument over the initial statement, or why this is a weaker argument than the initial statement. You want to constantly be going back to that statement throughout your arguments. And if you really want to push yourself, you want to make sure that you're explaining how that keyword or how that source of authority links back to the actual question at hand. Because it's all well and good being able to provide quotations like love thy neighbour, numbers for Christianity. But it's another thing to actually say how that actually works with the particular belief that you're discussing or with the particular practice that you're discussing. So by doing so, you're going to have that more detailed understanding, which again is going to allow you to create those clear and well-supported judgments. Everything that is linked back together is going to be well-supported. If you have just sort of thrown there with no real regard for how they connect, it's not going to be a well-supported judgment. It's going to be a very fragmented argument. And so making sure that you write in a way that is really clear and making sure that everything is linked and you're sort of, it's like maths when you're showing your workings. You want to show your thought process in your answer and how together. I have again gone through and shown you to have points together to formulate a 15-mark answer. Again, I would like you to try and use this mark scheme to help you write out an answer using a time for about 15 to 20 minutes. Again, you can pause it here and you can pull the points straight out from the arguments that are displayed here on the screen, or you can rewind the video and go back to the mark scheme if looking at the way that it is marked is more useful to you. The question is, a Christian must go to church, so you would want to say, well, does a church? Yes, because it builds a relationship with God, it builds a relationship with the community, it gives you an opportunity to perform sacraments, those sorts of ideas, versus, the possibility of being a Christian outside of the physical building, being part of the community, doing evangelism, spreading the word of God, talking about those other sort of roles that you can do as well. Those are going to be your 2 different arguments. You can see there at the bottom, you've also got references to source of authority that you might wish to use. Try and stick to that 15 to 20-minute timer. Make sure that you throw something in there. This is a strong argument because, this is a weak argument because, and remember, always link it back to the question. So hopefully by now you are feeling confident in what each of the question types are, how you go about answering them, and which paper you're going to be focusing on which particular topics. And now you can understand the way that it is laid out, the different types of exam questions, and actually be able to apply some of the techniques given by the exam boards, and actually be able to then practice some of those GCSE questions yourself. Remember, any question that you have a go at answering yourself, you can send to me. I'm happy to mark them and I'm happy to give you feedback on your answers and tell you how you could potentially improve, things to improve on. Thank you very much for listening. I hope this has been useful and I will see you next time.